So we are working on cycle 2, in which we want to change what our React app renders from just a simple list of students to a list of students that also have this test column here. And for each of these details, we want to be able to click on them and render another component down here that shows the details of that student's test scores. So we'll follow the directions here, and we'll start by creating a studentlist.js component that'll map and render each student. So I'll go to my components folder, I'll make a new file, we'll call this studentlist.js, and we'll go into there. Now we want to import React, first thing we do in any React app. And then for this, because we already have a main function that can store state, and because all we're doing is rendering these student names, we don't need state. So instead, we can make a functional component, which is much simpler. So we do that by naming our component student list. We always want to take in props as an argument. And we want to have a render method. Nope. And at the bottom of our file, we want to make sure that we're properly exporting this. We want to export default student list. Make sense so far? Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Got it. I got it.
Thank you.
Is that better? Can everyone see this, or should I zoom in? No, this is okay? All right, awesome. So in our student list component, then we want to go back to our main component. First thing we want to do is import it. So we want to import our student list from our student list file. And then we want to decide what we want to put in this student list component. So they ask us here to create a studentlist.js component that will map and render each student. So I am going to refactor this a little bit, where I'm going to take this out of the T body and put it in a T head, which I believe Amanda had done in her code along. So we'll move that up there.
I'm sorry, could you say what you just did again? I totally missed it.
Yeah, I just came to my main.js and I looked at my table and I said, okay, this row with this table header name was in T body. I actually want it to be in T head. So T head is where you store the information that's like the headers of your table, and then the body is where you store the information in HTML. These are just HTML tags. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So I look at my goal here, and I say I also want to have tests as a table header, so I'm going to put that there. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this whole T body and pull it into my new student list render. And can anyone tell me why it's better for me to take this whole T body with our map statement inside rather than just copy and pasting our map statement? Because we need to give it structure, right? In React, it always asks us that when we render some JSX, we need to have whatever we're rendering enclosed in one parent container. So it doesn't matter what that container is. It could be a div, it could be a T-body, it could be a span, it could be paragraph. As long as you have some container that is HTML and is containing all of your other logic, React will be happy. Okay? So if I put this here, then I can go back to my main.js where this logic used to be, and instead render this component. Okay? But here, in my student list, when I had this logic before in my main.js, we were pulling this information from state. But we no longer have direct access to state in our student list component now that we've modularized it. So what do I need to do in order to make sure that I have the right information in my child component? Send it to my props, right? I need to assign props. So it looks like here I need the students. So I'll go here and I'll give it the props name students, and I will pass in this dot state dot students. Now, does everyone know what props is? What is props? Properties, right? But how is it stored in JavaScript? It's stored as an object, right? So props is an object that has key value pairs. And so the key is going to be whatever name you assign here, and the value is going to be whatever you pass down with this given name. So if I pass this down, this .state.students as students, then I can access it in here as props.students. Now, if I were to change the name of students to something like, let's say banana, then I would also need to reference it inside of my second component as props.banana. So it really doesn't matter so much what you name your props as long as you keep track of it throughout. But of course, we want to have variable names that make sense. So students is much better than banana in this case. Okay, cool. So let's see what we've got so far. Going to make sure this is running. It is, and then we'll navigate to our localhost 3000. What? Looks like we have a bug. Let's see. Render is not defined in student list. Aha! What should this be instead of render? Return. There we go, great. So now we have our student list re-rendered. So we have basically the same thing that we had before, but we've now refactored it. Are there any questions on this so far? No? Okay, cool. I just want to show you quickly how to inspect props, just to sort of talk about that for 1 sec. So if we console log our props, let me render this. Then we're going to get 2 objects here. Why is this object empty, the first one? Can anybody tell me? It's before it mounted, right? So in our main component, the way that our component lifecycle works is first our constructor runs, then our render function runs, then component did mount runs, and then after that render runs again. So before component did mount runs, right, component did mount is where we're calling this .getStudents, which is where we actually get our information from the database. So before we run component did mount, state.students is an empty array. And that is something that gets passed down to this child component. So even though we've moved our logic into a child component, we are still going to be beheld by the constraints of state updating here. Okay? Then we could look at our props here, and like I said before, if I change this to banana, it's gonna break, so I gotta change that. Then my students will be called banana. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, so we'll change that back. Great. Okay. So what do we need to do next? Next, we need to add a word like details that when clicked renders all the students' test scores below the table. Okay, so I know that if I want to click something, I need to call what here? OnClick. And does anybody know what OnClick takes here? It takes a function, and it actually takes this function as a callback. So let's say you were calling a function that didn't need to take in a parameter. Let's say we'd say setStudent. We could just, well, it actually would be props.setStudent. We could just write it like this. But if we want our function to take in any parameters, we can't pass it in as just a simple callback function. Instead, we have to declare an anonymous function, which just means kind of writing these parentheses and an arrow, and then actually invoke this function with the information that we want inside. Is that clear? Cool. All right, so let's see. So I'm already kind of getting ahead of myself. I'm saying that when I click this TD element, right, which is going to be these details. Actually, I can just get rid of this for 1 second so we can see what that looks like. So yes, I have not gotten it from anywhere. I have just been a forward-thinking programmer and said, I know when I click details that I want it to set a student. So I'm preemptively giving myself this name of this function, set student, that I have to then create somewhere else. So it's actually a question for the class. Where is it best to create this set student method? Is it best to create it here inside student list, or is it better to create it in here in our main component? Why is it better to do it in our main component? Right, you could use it in every file. You could take that method and you could pass it down elsewhere. Why else might it be good to put it in main? It's easier to set the state, right? It's also really good React practice to kind of have parent components that control a lot of the logic and then child functional components that are just there to display various parts of the UI. So it's just kind of these good practices that we want to definitely get into using. So what I'm going to need to do here then is define a new function that I will call setStudent. And I think this function should take in a student because I want to know what student I'm going to set. And I want that student to be reflected on my state. So I'm going to create a new property on my state called selectedStudent, and I'm going to initialize this to an object. Does anyone remember what this law is called? Tom's, right? Tom's first law is great. You always want to initialize your state with an empty version of whatever data structure you plan on passing in later. Great, so if I have set students, then I need to do this dot set state, and I could say that student, selected student is equal to student. Now here's a fun React trick for set state. It's more, I guess, taps into how just objects work, key value pairs. But if I name this selected student, then I can actually just do this shorthand here. And what it'll do is it'll say, okay, selected student, and I say this dot set state selected student. The state knows that it already has a property called select student, so it can just pass that in instead of having to write it twice. Yeah?
Why is selected students an object?
So, you mean why are there these curly braces here?
No, up top and in your constructor function.
Why is this an object? So my data, let's see if I still have it in the console here. Yeah. So if I look at my student data, each student is an object. So this is something that I had pulled out from my inspection of how our data is stored. Theoretically, you could have just student be maybe like an array of information, or it could just be a name, and you would have to structure this differently depending on what data type you have. But since they're already giving you the data, you can kind of like extrapolate that information from there. Okay. Great. So I am using lexical this inside of my method. So what do I have to do to make sure this works? Find it. So I go up to my constructor and I say this dot select student is equal to this dot select student dot bind. I take in the parameter this. Great. So I've selected my student. I'm going to console log it too, just so we can see what happens. Let me try it.
Did you do like set student and then select student? Yeah, I think you
Did I name them differently? Okay, let's see. Set student, set student, set student. There you go. Thank you. See, this pair programming, always so helpful. You have someone else to catch your small errors. Great. Selected student. Okay. So, sure. Okay. So let's run through this, make sure we have everything down. We have our set student method, which sets the state to whatever selected student we pass in. We've created a new selected student property on our state, and we have bound our set student function to our class. Okay. Inside of our student list component, we have props.setStudent, as this onClick here. And am I ready to go, or am I missing something? Let's see, let's try to run it. Okay, great. I get my name, I have these details, and I click on it. Uh-oh, what happened? Can anyone read my error? Props.setStudent is not a function. Why? I don't know. I defined it here. I'm using it here. It looks like it's a function.
In render?
In the render? Here? What?
I don't know, but I think
So, okay, so somewhere I need to do something in here. Does anyone have any idea what I need to do? Add it to student list. What do you mean add it to student list? I like this.
Well, right now, students only hold the students array.
Okay.
And you need to make it, hold, or maybe make them separate things, like students is this state as students,
Mhm.
and like select students is this state select.
Right. Yep. I need to pass this down as props. Right. So if I'm going to use this, sorry, not select students, set student. If I'm going to use this set student method that I'm defining in my parent class, in the child class, I need to pass it down as props. So it'd be this dot, and since this is a method that is part of this class, we always want to call it this dot set students. Otherwise, you will get an error. Okay? No, so you only need to say this dot state if you're actually grabbing things from state. And right now we're not grabbing the selected student from state. That'll come later. Just what we're grabbing is this method called set student. And so if we're ever calling a method, we just say this dot method name instead of doing this dot state, because our methods aren't stored in the state. They're instead stored as methods of this class. Does that make sense?
Well, I think it should be this dot set student instead of students, right? Your set student.
Good catch. Good catch. Very nice. All right, let's see if it works. Well, gotta wait for this to update. Webpack is just so slow, you guys. Listening. There we go. Okay. So if I click details, great, I get a selected student. So we know that we've reached here. And let's see what our selected student is. Go. Great, so if I select my student, then I get this object here that has my student name. Great, okay. So what is my next task? Are there any other questions on this part so far? Or is everyone feeling okay? All right, cool. So our next part that we want to do is we want to render the student's test scores below the table by creating a new component, this single student.js component. So we can go to our components, make a new file, single student.js. Again, first thing we want to do here when we get in is import React, set up our function, take in props, give it a return, and then export. Okay. And then in my main.js, I want to make sure I import it. And I want to decide where I want to put it. So I only want this to display if I've selected a student, right? So we need to have some sort of conditional logic that lets me only display it under certain conditions. So you can't, unfortunately, use if-else statements within JSX. So instead we have to use ternaries. So for here I would say if there is this.state.selectedStudent.id, meaning this has to be something other than an empty object, right? It has to have an ID quality. So if on my state I have a selected student, then I want to render my single student. If not, I don't want to render anything. So I'll just put null. Okay. Now what do we need to have in our single student? It looks like we need to have their average grade and then another table with their summary of their subjects and grades. So if I go to my single student, I might give it a div so everything can be wrapped nicely. I might display the student's name. So give it like an H3. And I'd have to pass in my student information. So I'll do that first this time. So for single student, what do I want to pass in as a prop for my student data? Do I want to pass in the whole state or part of the state? Just selected student, right? Since I'm doing my single student view, I just want to pass in selected student. So I will do that here. I'll just say student is equal to this dot state dot selected student. Okay? And then if I were to console log my props here, okay, let's see if this will work. I haven't tested it yet. There could be a bug somewhere. Click details. Nope. Student is not defined. Props.student. Great, so if I click it, awesome. I get my single student props, which just has students on it. So props.student. Okay, so I pass in my single student, and I think I'm okay. So I can, sorry? Right, so if I just console log props, I'll show you this here. It gives me this object that has a property student. So if I wanted to access student, I'd have to say props.student. Cool. So in here, let's see, I want to give the student's name, so I have to look at my data and see what format that's in. Okay, it looks like there is a full name property. So for that, I would want to say props.student.fullname. Okay. And then below it, I want to have another header that says something about average test scores. And we may get to that function, but we may not. That might be something you can go over yourself. But basically, they write a helper function to calculate the average test score. And then you would call that function in the H2. I'm actually going to make it an H4. Okay, but we'll leave that for now. Instead, we want to make sure we get this table down. So again, to make my HTML table, I'm going to do a table tag here. I'm going to give myself a T head. And let's see, I need 2 rows, or 1 row, which each have a header. The first header is going to be subject. And the second header is going to be grade. Okay, and then in my T-body, T-body, I'm going to have a map of my information. So here I want to map through the test scores. So where in my students object are the test scores stored? In tests, right? And what format are they in? An array. So if you see an array and you want to show all of it in your JSX, what kind of method do you want to use to display it? Map! Map is our best friend. Map and React go hand in hand. They're amazing. Great couple. All right, so we'll do this, nope, props dot students dot tests dot map. And we can take each test, and for each test, we want to return, what do we want to return? We want to return the subject and the grade. So we'll have one row, and in the row we will have test dot subject and test dot grade. Okay. All right. Do you want anything else? I think that might be good. Here. So I actually didn't. This is another fun trick. So you can with map open up a set of curly braces like this, and then have the return statement underneath that, like return, and then open up the parentheses. Or you could do something that's called an implicit return with an arrow function. So if I do an arrow function and I just have an open set of parentheses, then it tells it return this. So if I'm only returning something from a function, I can use this implicit return. So it's fun to do that with map, to sort of like make your code look cleaner and show people that you know fancy tricks. Okay, so let's see. Waiting for the dinosaur to get happy again. We click it. Oh no, props.students is undefined. Did I spell it wrong? Let's see. Aha, props.student. I did. I spell things wrong a lot, you guys. Great. Uh-oh, what's this here? Does anyone know why React likes us to have the key? Okay, so why React wants us to have this key here?
Something about because it changes the, like it re-renders and it helps it keep track of like what to set to state or something.
So the way that React works is it creates it creates a virtual DOM, which is sort of like a representation of what our HTML on our DOM would be. I think they're stored in nodes. And whenever you change props or state and it re-renders the page, what it does is it does a thing called diffing, where it takes the old version of the virtual DOM and the new version of the virtual DOM and it compares them together, and it says, okay, what things do I need to update and change? And it only changes those things instead of re-rendering the whole entire virtual DOM. So having keys here, which are like unique properties that go with this DOM element, it allows it to actually do that faster. So it's something that improves web performance and something that you want to do for good practice. Cool. So I will do that. Where should I put my key? DR. Put it on the parent element of whatever you are mapping through. So I think I can do, does tests have an ID? Does it? Yep, tests have an ID, so I can just use that. Test.id. I think we can refresh this. Click it. Hooray! James Dean scores, Dan Abramoff scores, Cary Grant scores, everyone. They're not very good in school, you guys. I don't know. Okay. Are there any questions? Anything that we went over? React at all? No?
Without like you writing the whole helper function and stuff, can you just show how you would invoke it?
Sure.
Like just without, yeah.
Yeah, so if I wrote a helper function, let's say it's like const calc average, and I would probably want to take in the tests array and do something with it and eventually like return the average. In, where is it, average test score, I would just say return calc average and invoke it with props.student.tests. So just like that. Cool. Anything else? All right. Happy Saturday, everyone. Hopefully this recording works, so I will post it in the Slack, I guess. Yeah.
Will the solution also be available?
So if you git checkout solution, It's already in the repo.
Okay, thank you.